Hello, 6th grade. How are you doing? Welcome to Conversation. Today we are going to continue talking about the great civilization of Egypt. So, let's get started. We're going to be going to page 34. That's going to be our first activity today, just to review how the Great Pyramids of Egypt were created. So, if you go to page 34, let's talk about that process. On page 34, you're going to see there are 4 different vocabulary words that we're going to be looking at. The first one is were taken off, were pulled off, were cut, and were put. You'll notice all of these are in the past tense, okay, because we are looking at, just understanding a little bit more about what happened in the past. So, if we look at those vocabulary words, we'll notice that each one of those words we can use to describe the process with which the Egyptians used to build the pyramids. Okay, so let's look at the activity on the bottom. The activity says, read the magazine article and complete the sentences with the verb forms from the box. Listen and check. All right, so let's read the first part. It says, here is how the pyramids of Giza were built. They were made from big blocks of rock. First, they had to find ways of taking the big blocks to Giza. Here's how they did it. So as you can see inside of the pictures, you'll notice that there are several pictures of the process that the Egyptians used. Right? We have the first step, second step, third step, and the fourth step. What is going on in these pictures? What are the people in Giza using to build the pyramids and transport the materials? Well, let's read the first part of the steps to see if we can figure out a little bit more about their process. It says, number 1, the blocks blank from the sides of the mountains. Out of those vocabulary words which are on the top, which word would fit best in the blank? Well, this man, who I think is a slave, is using a chisel and a hammer to cut through the stone blocks, right? So we're going to say the blocks were cut from the sides of the mountain. Okay? What's going on in step 2? Well, I see a boat. I also see a sail. I see some slaves on a ship, possibly some Egyptians also. It says, then the blocks blank onto the boats and taken to Giza. Were the blocks pulled? Were they cut? Were they put? Were they taken off? I believe they were probably put, right? They had to put them onto the boat. So we're going to say, then the blocks were put onto boats and taken to Giza. All right? Put. All right. Number 3. Read number 3 for me. It says the blocks blank the boats and put onto special sleds. We already used this one, right? We already used to cut. We already used put. So the first 2 are the ones that we're going to look at, right? So we're taken off or we're pulled. Well, it looks like there's a motion that's happening right here, right? There's kind of sliding off of the platform and then maybe put onto these sleds, right? Because then you see this next picture, there's the sled. Okay, that's called a sled. So I think that we're going to be we're taken off, right? That's the word that we're going to put on there. Were taken off the boats and put onto special sleds. And the last part says, the sleds blank by horses and slaves. Well, you can see that these horses and slaves are pulling, in other words, exerting force towards this direction. They're pulling the materials, right? So we're going to put inside of that blank, the sleds were pulled by horses and slaves. All right, good. So those vocabulary words, boys and girls, are important to use when we're trying to describe what happened in Egypt, okay? That they were building those pyramids. Good. Check your answers to make sure that they're okay. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to go to the next part of our lesson. We're going to be watching a video on Brain Pop to see how the Egyptians built their pyramids, okay? Specifically what types of materials that they were using. You'll see that here we have blocks, but what were those blocks made out of? Well, let's watch this video to find out a little bit more about the process of building something just like the pyramids.
Hey Moby, I don't think that's gonna stand up. Dear Tim and Moby, how are buildings made? From VC. Well, all buildings have to fight against the force of gravity. Gravity pulls everything on the surface toward the center of the Earth. So any structure we build has to resist a force that wants to pull it down. Well, for a structure to stay up, it has to work with the forces of compression and tension.
All right, so far we've learned a couple of words, gravity and force, and now we're going to learn about compression and tension, okay? What types of forces are needed to understand when we're building a structure?
Compression is a force that squeezes matter together. When matter is compressed, it gets shorter. And tension is just the opposite. It's a force that pulls the material apart. When matter is in tension, it gets longer. Some things we build stay up pretty easily, without any internal structure. One of the most basic structures is the post and lintel. You can find one of the simplest examples of the post and lintel in Stonehenge in England. In a post and lintel structure, two vertical columns support a horizontal beam. When weight is applied to the beam, it starts to bend, compressing the columns. The whole thing works together to support the weight of the load. But the post and lintel isn't just for holding up big stones.
So that concept of support is also very important. If our foundation is not supportive enough, then obviously our structure will fall. We talked a little bit about in the video about those two concepts of force, which are compression and tension. Think about that as we continue watching the video.
You can see the post and lintel at work in something as simple as a doorway. Here, the post and lintel structure supports the weight of the wall on top of the doorway. The post and lintel isn't the only structure that can support a lot of weight without internal supports. When Moby tried to build a tower earlier, all the weight was put on one block. That's not a very sturdy construction. But if we build a pyramid, the weight of the blocks is distributed on a wider base, which stabilizes the structure. This is how the pyramids in Egypt were built, and it's part of the reason they've stayed up for so many thousands of years. Pyramids can be as tall as they are because they rest on a really wide base that can support the weight of all the stone. The wider the base, the higher you can build the structure. Imagine if the pyramids were 5 times as tall. The base of the pyramid would have to be enormous to support all that height. Pyramids and posts and lintels are good for simple buildings, but eventually people had to figure out better ways of keeping structures up. When you get into suspension bridges and skyscrapers, it gets a whole lot more complicated, but it's always good to know the basics. I think you're going to need more blocks for that, Moby.
Alright, so that video showed us a little bit about how the pyramids were built, what they used, and things like that. So let's actually take a quick quiz. There's only 3 questions that we're going to be going through. The first question says, what is the difference between tension and compression? Well, again, those were the 2 types of force that we talked about in the video. Tension and compression are just opposites. Let's look at the first one. Tension pushes matter together. Compression pulls it apart. Now, that doesn't make sense. Compression actually pushes things together. Tension pulls matter apart. Compression pulls it together. That makes more sense. Let's go to letter B. Good. Question number 2. If an architect didn't take gravity into account while designing a structure, there's a good chance that structure would fall down, catch on fire, sink slowly into the ground, Be blown down by wind. Well, letter C is not correct because gravity is just the opposite. It wouldn't bring it down to the ground like that. I think it would probably fall down, right? Because the gravitational force pulls things to the earth. Go. And number 3. If you wanted to build a post and lintel structure out of popsicle sticks, what's the minimum number of sticks you need? Well, not 1. 2 doesn't make sense either. Well, if we have a 3 popsicle stick structure, the 2 posts are holding up the lintel on the top, so I think 3 is our correct answer. All right, great. We're going to skip to the next exercise, which I'd like to talk about is a video that talks a little bit about the type of material and how those pyramids were built. Okay, so let's actually watch this video.
We can trace the evolution of their construction and see the ancient Egyptians using trial and error, even making a few mistakes, which basically tells us they didn't need aliens to build them, they just needed science. You guys really liked that video, but a few of you were a little bothered that despite the fact it was called Who Built the Pyramids, I didn't talk about how the pyramids were made.
So while you're watching, I'd like you to think about the question, how were the pyramids made? Okay, I'm going to here we go. Ready?
So, let's talk about it. The 100+ pyramids scattered around Egypt were all built a bit differently, but we're going to focus on the big one. Let's review the stats. The Great Pyramid originally rose more than 146 meters tall and contained about 2.3 million stone blocks. But the start of any construction project truly begins with the foundation, which is impressive in its own right. Its base is leveled less than 2 centimeters, it's square within 11, and its edges are aligned to the compass within 3/60ths of a degree. This precision is pretty incredible since compasses didn't actually exist yet, and since 4,500 years ago, the North Star was in a completely different place. But finding north is actually pretty easy. Just watch where any star rises and sets during the night and cut the angle in half. After that square...
So how did the Egyptians build their pyramids? Well, it looks like they used a lot of different science and math in order to build their pyramids. For example, we learned that the astronomy of the calculations was very important, using the stars and other angles to understand what the foundation should look like and different things like leveling of the building. Also, the foundation is very important. The calculations that the Egyptians needed to use were very, very precise.
Squaring the sides just requires measuring a right angle. Pythagoras and his equation came way later, but ancient cultures like the Egyptians knew a 3-4-5 triangle made a 90-degree corner. They could even make a right angle with 2 circles. The line connecting the intersection of the arcs is perpendicular to a line through their centers. To level the base, some theories say the Egyptians used water-filled channels as natural levels, but this isn't likely when you consider how much water they'd have to carry in to keep it from evaporating. But if you can make a right angle, you can make a level. Put that on some legs and you can even level over long distances. When you think about it, a pyramid is just a bunch of stacked squares, so if you can master this measurement, you're most of the way there. Now we just need some stones. The Great Pyramid's core is made of more than 2 million blocks of rough yellow limestone. This is quarried right next to the pyramids, which is a big reason why they chose sites like Giza, where prehistoric oceans had deposited this building material right under their feet. They would dig channels and pry these blocks right from the earth.
All right, so could you describe what's going on inside of this image, inside of the video? What is this slave doing in order to move the block? Were they pushing? Were they pulling? Were they leveling up? What is this person doing? Well, it looks like they are trying to push the block using a simple machine or a stick in order to move the material from one spot to another. Okay, it's probably because of the weight of the block. It was probably very heavy, and moving that by himself was almost impossible.
Earth. And the size of the blocks was actually determined by the natural thickness of these limestone layers. You can see evidence of these layers in the Sphinx, which was actually dug out of the earth, not built on top of it. These pyramids were originally covered in smooth white limestone from quarries up the Nile, which was stolen to use in other buildings thousands of years ago. We found many chisels, drills, and saws used.
Those words, chisels, drills, saws, Similar to on page 34 inside of our book, I had mentioned before that the Egyptians had used different tools. Those are very important tools when constructing the ancient structure of the pyramids and the Sphinx.
Used at these quarries, and the only metal Egyptians had access to was copper. That's a pretty soft metal, but when a slurry of sand and powdered rock is poured in as an abrasive, even copper tools can cut limestone. To build the Great Pyramid in 23 years, an Olympic swimming pool's worth of stone had to be quarried every 8 days. That's a lot, but modern pyramid building experiments using technology available to ancient Egyptians calculated this amount of stone could be cut and moved by a quarry team of 12 to 1,500 workers, which is totally doable. Heavier stones, like the granite used in the pyramid's inner chambers, are much harder than limestone. They were literally chipped out by hand using heavy dolerite hammerstones, which we've also found a lot of. It would have taken a full day's pounding to chip away just a few centimeters, but then again, they didn't have Twitter to distract them. We found...
All right, so I'm going to ask you a few questions. Let's see. First question. What materials did the Egyptians use to build their pyramids? How important is the foundation of those structures? What did the Egyptians have to rely on in order to make accurate calculations for those structures? Do we still use math and other types of calculations when we use for building our own structures nowadays? Why is it important that a structure is level? What would happen if it's not level? And the last question, how were these types
from
of
the earth.
how are these types of materials moved from one place to another? Now that brings us back to the vocabulary that we had looked at on page 34, okay? How they were cut, they were put, they were taken off, all right? Those are all really important verbs to use to describe the structures and how they were put together, okay? What we're going to do is we are going to build our own structure. So for next class, next Thursday, you need to bring your own material so that you can make your own structure. For example, you could bring in marshmallows, you could bring in popsicle sticks, you could bring in, what other things could you bring in? Plastic bottles, you could bring in books, you could bring in blocks, you could bring in, I don't know, maybe even like cookies that are shaped like blocks, okay? Or whatever you'd like, so that you can bring these materials, and then we're going to discuss how we are building the structure, how stable it's going to be, what we did in order to build it, okay? We're going to be building this next week, Thursday, in class. So make sure you bring your materials so that you can participate in this activity, okay? The last thing that we're going to do, boys and girls, is just try to understand this concept a little bit more by giving you a couple more resources as far as building your structure. So for example, if you wanted to research something, you could research that in BrainPop or YouTube or whatever it might be. So for example, if you wanted to research sand, or let's try rock, you could look up types of rocks, and you could see what type of rock might be the best for your structure. For example, types of rocks, we can look at this. We can watch this video if we really want to.
Basic types: igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. Magma is molten material from deep inside the earth that comes to the surface through volcanoes. You may know it as lava. That's what it's called when it's above ground. Igneous rocks form when this molten material cools. Not all of the magma makes it out of the volcano. The rocks that form when trapped magma cools are called intrusive igneous rocks.
So in ancient Egypt, they didn't have the same level of volcanoes or the level of volcanic activity that we have here in Costa Rica. So that probably influenced the amount of materials and the types of materials that they used for their structures. Here in Costa Rica, we have lots of volcanic activity. So the building structures in this country are very different than some of the building structures in other countries. Okay, so I'd like you to do some research on what material you're going to use, how you're going to build it. You could even do a Google search if you really wanted to, and you could look up, for example, man-made structures. Okay, and do a quick Google search on that. You come up with a whole bunch of different buildings. Okay. These are all really interesting designs, so we'll have to look at the different types of designs for our class for next time. You can also look up, for example, Toothpick Experiment. And here, you could try to look for this types of things, okay? Playing around with the materials, how they're going to contract or compress, like we had talked about in the video, maybe even looking at different shapes of what you're going to be using, okay? So this is all really important to understand the activity for next time, okay? So hopefully you are having those gears move for next class so that you can participate in this activity. And we will see you next Thursday in class in conversation.